So this is the lecture on conformity and obedience. So last time we talked about how persuasion attempts often make people have attitudes that lead them to do things that, in the absence of these persuasion attempts, they wouldn't otherwise do. And we also talked about how people can make people comply with their request, and in the absence of these requests, they wouldn't do what they would otherwise do. But now I want to talk about two other forces that make people do things they perhaps wouldn't do otherwise: conformity and obedience to authority. Conformity is simply when people feel compelled to adhere to the norms of a social group. The vast majority of people conform to the norms of the groups that they belong to. This is no better demonstrated than looking at the behavior of people in contemporary society who think of themselves as quote unquote nonconformist. For example, consider groups like punk rockers, biker gangs, and goths. Although people who belong to these groups believe that they are nonconformists, their behavior says otherwise. As you can see from these photos, members of these groups often conform to the appearance and dress norms of the groups that they belong to. Conformity occurs because of what social psychologists call majority influence. Majority influence is when people feel real or perceived pressure from fellow group members to conform. As this definition states, this pressure can be real or perceived. An example of real pressure to conform is when other group members verbally criticize or ridicule a group member for not conforming, such as when a group of punk rockers makes fun of a fellow punk rocker for listening to bands like Nickelback and Coldplay. An example of perceived pressure to conform is when people believe that other group members will criticize and ridicule them if they don't conform, such as the fear of ridicule that a goth kid might experience if his fellow goths found out that he was really into Rihanna. Majority influence can either lead to private acceptance or public compliance. Private acceptance is when people conform because they genuinely believe that others in the group are correct. On the other hand, public compliance is when people conform publicly without genuinely believing other group members are correct. Majority influence occurs in one of two ways. The first way it occurs is through what's called informational influence. Informational influence occurs when people conform to others because they believe these others are correct in their knowledge about reality. Informational influence occurs when people are unsure about something or a situation is ambiguous, and they look to fellow group members as a source of information on how to act or what to believe. Informational influence often leads to private acceptance because people genuinely feel that other people have correct knowledge, even if they don't. Informational influence was first demonstrated in an experiment where researchers put participants in a completely dark room and shined a dot of light on the wall. The light was actually stationary, but for the participants, the light looked like it moved around erratically because of an optical illusion called the autokinetic effect. The researchers used this optical illusion to test for informational influence because, since they knew that the light wasn't moving but the participants didn't, they could see how people come to judgments in the most ambiguous of situations. The researchers asked the participants how much the light was moving. How much the participants said the light was moving varied considerably, as well it should, since the light wasn't actually moving at all. After the participants sat in the room alone and judged how much the light was moving by themselves, the researchers then took the same participants together in groups of 3 and placed them back into the autokinetic situation. Although the estimates the participants had made when alone were quite different, the estimates they made in groups converged on a common standard. For example, even though the participants started out with vastly different estimates of how much the light was moving, in the end the participants agreed with one another about how much the light was moving. Again, remember, the light's not moving at all. In other words, people were using each other as a source of information in this context, which is how information influence works. And informational influence most likely occurs in 4 types of situations. First, informational influence most likely occurs when the situation at hand is ambiguous. Many social psychologists argue that this is the most crucial factor in determining if people will be susceptible to informational influence. The more uncertain people are on how to act or what to believe in a given situation, the more they will turn to others to find out how to act or what to believe. Second, informational influence most likely occurs when the situation is a crisis situation. Crises, of course, often occur simultaneously with ambiguity. In a crisis situation, people often don't have time to think about what they should do or believe because they need to act immediately. Thus, in situations of crises, people often look around at other people, observe their behavior, and use this behavior as information about how to act. For example, I personally would have no idea what to do during an earthquake, since I've never experienced one. But if I were in California and an earthquake occurred, I would look around at the behavior of other people around me for information about how to act in that situation. Third, informational influence most likely occurs when other people in the group are perceived as experts regarding particular types of information. The more expertise a person seems to have for a particular situation, the more likely people will rely on them for information on how to act. For example, if I'm in California during an earthquake, I would look to long-term residents of California as experts on how to respond to an earthquake and use their behavior as information on how I should act in that situation. Finally, informational influence most likely occurs when people believe that it's very important to be right. When people feel that it is important to be right for whatever reason, they are more susceptible to using information provided by others' actions than when people don't feel that it's all that important to be right, that it's okay to be wrong. The second way in which majority influence occurs is through normative influence. Normative influence is when people conform to others' expectations in order to receive the social rewards and avoid the punishments that are contingent on meeting these expectations. For example, some punk rock kids, even though they don't want to, dye their hair neon red and spike it up so that they'll win the acceptance of their punk rock peers and avoid being shunned by them. People are quite susceptible to normative influence. And this was shown in the now classic comparison line experiment, a replication that you will see in the clip that I've included in this folder for these series of lectures. So take a break from this, go watch that clip. It's real short, it's about 5 minutes, and you'll see the replication of the line experiment and showing how strong normative influence can be. So, as you saw in those experiments, even though others in the group were obviously wrong, people often still went along with the group. This demonstrates how strong normative influence can be. It can make people do or say things that they in fact know are wrong. Normative influence usually leads to public compliance, but not private acceptance. That is, people experiencing normative influence know that the group is wrong, but they publicly say or do what the other group members are saying or doing. Several things influence whether or not a person will be susceptible to normative influence. The first factor that influences whether people will be susceptible to normative influence is the importance of group membership. Social psychologists find that people who are highly attached and attracted to a group are more likely to experience normative influence than people who are not very attached or attracted to the group. When people are attached or attracted to a group, they are often afraid to rock the boat of the group, so to speak, by going against the group, even when they believe that the group is wrong. People do this because they are afraid that going against the group might get them kicked out of the group. A second factor that influences whether people will experience normative influence is the size of the group. Groups of 4 exert more normative influence than a group of 2. In other words, as the size of the group increases to 3 or beyond, so does conforming behavior. However, there are diminishing returns on the effects of group size on normative influence. As you can see from this graph, after about 3 or 4 members, the effects of group size on normative influence stabilizes. So a group of 3 that gives a wrong answer to the line question works about as well as a group of 10 given a wrong answer in causing people to experience normative influence. The third factor that influences whether people will experience normative influence is whether the majority is unanimous. That is, if everyone else in the group thinks or acts in the same way. Unanimous majorities are more influential than non-unanimous majorities. Even one person deviating from the majority is enough to lessen the effects of normative influence. For instance, in a variation of the line experiment, the researchers had one of the actors give the correct answer. And as you can see here, with just this one defector, people were much less acceptable to normative influence. The percentage of people who gave the wrong answer fell from 33% when the majority was unanimous to 8% when there was a single defector. Single defectors don't even need to be right to lessen the effects of normative influence. For instance, in another variation of the line experiment, the researchers had one of the actors given an answer different from the other actors. However, this answer was also wrong. As you can see here, people were about as acceptable to normative influence when the defector gave the correct answer as when the defector gave the incorrect answer. The results indicate that people see defectors as a sign that they can also defect and thus are less acceptable to normative influence. For example, if a biker wants to start wearing a helmet but is afraid to do so because all of his biker friends don't wear helmets, then he'll probably not wear a helmet. However, if just one of his fellow bikers begins to wear a helmet, he'll see this as a sign that it's okay to go against the group and he'll start wearing a helmet. Fourth factor that influences whether people will experience normative influence is their perceived competence. When people believe they are knowledgeable about a particular subject or skilled at a particular task, they are less likely to experience normative influence than those who don't think that they are knowledgeable or skilled. For example, if a person believes that she is really good at grilling a steak, nobody grills a steak better than her, she will not listen to the advice of her friends on how to properly grill a steak, even if all of her friends are telling her to grill the steak in the exact same way. She'll just discount it all. She'll say, you just don't know what you're talking about. The fifth factor that influences whether people will experience normative influence is whether or not people are being watched and monitored by other group members. People who are or believe they are being watched and monitored by other group members are more likely to experience normative influence than those who aren't or don't believe they are being watched or monitored. This is why normative influence is more powerful when people are in the immediate presence of other group members than when people are separated from fellow group members by time and or space. And a sixth factor that influences whether people will experience normative influence is their self-concepts. People with more interdependent self-concepts are more prone to normative influence than people with more independent self-concepts. People with more interdependent self-concepts are more prone to normative influence because they care about maintaining good relationships with others, and going against a group could damage these relationships. This explains the finding that non-Westerners and women in Western societies are more prone to normative influence than Westerners and men in Western societies, respectively. Non-Westerners and women tend to have interdependent self-concepts, while Westerners and men tend to have independent self-concepts. Now, of course, people don't always toe the line when they experience normative influence. Individuals do often go against the group, and social psychologists have found that 2 factors allow people to resist normative influence while at the same time avoid being punished by group members or getting kicked out of the group. The first of these factors is called idiosyncratic credits. Idiosyncratic credits refers to the goodwill that people earn over time by conforming to the group. People who usually go along with the group want to build up a lot of goodwill in the eyes of others. And members who have built up a lot of goodwill over time can defect from the group on occasion without negative consequences by cashing in, so to speak, this goodwill or these idiosyncratic credits. For example, say that a person has belonged to a group for a long time and has pretty much gone along with what other group members have wanted to do. Because of this, she has built up a lot of idiosyncratic credits over time. And this allows her to go against the group from time to time if she feels that it's necessary to do so, and without any negative consequences. And a second factor that allows people to resist normative influence is minority influence. Minority influence occurs when a minority of group members is able to influence the majority of group members. It doesn't happen often, but it does on occasion. Minorities are influential through informational influence. That is, they provide the other group members with information that they believe is reflective of reality. They can't use social pressure because there's less of them than there are the others. And minorities are most influential when they are, one, consistent in their defection. They stay the course. They do not waver in their belief and their arguments. They are flexible in their negotiation style. They're not too rigid. They're willing to compromise. And when there are several members, when there's just one, again, many is always better than one in this case. Another way that others can influence people is if these others are perceived authority figures. People tend to obey the commands of authority figures, whether they be parents, scientists, politicians, or teachers, even when these authority figures command people to do things that they don't want to do. The social psychologist who studied obedience to authority the most was Stanley Milgram. He performed a number of experiments to see how authority figures influence people's behavior. He also investigated the conditions and factors that influence whether or not a person would obey the commands of an authority figure. In his classic experiments, Milgram wanted to see what factors influence whether people would obey the commands of authority figures to give people powerful and potentially lethal electric shocks. Overall, what Milgram found was that obedience to authority, or when people follow the commands of authority figures despite not wanting to perform said commands, was a powerful factor in determining people's behavior. Milgram's research was stimulated by the atrocity of the Jewish Holocaust that occurred during World War II. As the war crime trials of the perpetrators of the Jewish Holocaust seemed to indicate, the perpetrators were not sadists. Rather, they were just ordinary people doing what they were told to do by other people in positions of authority. This stimulated Milgram's research because he wanted to test the claim that people often do horrible things to people because of the influence of authority figures. Milgram set up a fake experiment about learning and punishment where the participant was the teacher and the learner was actually a tape recording to see if people would obey the authority of a scientist and under what conditions participants' obedience would fluctuate. He set up the situation in such a way as to where the participants believed that they would hurt another person if they obeyed the authority figures. That's why he used the shock box that went all the way to 450 volts, a potentially lethal shock level. FYI, most electric outlets are 110, and large appliances such as stoves and air conditioners have 240 volt electric outlets. So 450 volts is almost double the amount of voltage powering an electric dryer or a large air conditioner. And so to see a relatively recent replication of Milgram's experiments, you'll find a clip in the folder for these series of lectures that shows just that. So again, take a break from this lecture, go watch that clip. It's about 10 minutes, and you'll see almost exactly the same thing that Milgram did way back in the 60s. Now, before Milgram performed his experiments, he asked various people what the maximum level of shock they thought they would give people. Psychiatrists, on average, thought the maximum level of shock they would give would be 135 volts, while college students and middle-class adults thought they would give a maximum shock on average of just 150 volts. Not a pleasant level of shock, but not a level that will kill anybody either. These people, as you'll see, would have been absolutely shocked by their results, pun intended. This is what makes obedience to authority so dangerous. People often think that they won't be influenced by authority figures, but in actuality, a lot of people often are. So, through a series of experiments, Milgram investigated the various factors that influence people's obedience to authority. And the first factor that Milgram investigated was how the proximity and willingness of the victims affected people's obedience to authority. In regards to proximity, or how close the victim was visually and physically, Milgram found that the closer the proximity, the less likely people were obedient to authority. As you can see here, as the proximity of the victim increased, obedience to authority decreased. When the victim was remote, that is, the participants could not see nor could they hear the victim, 65% of participants gave the maximum level of shock of 450 volts. When the participants could hear the victim but not see the victim, which was the condition you saw in the clip, around 63% of participants gave the maximum level of shock. However, when the victim was in the same room as the participants, only 40% of the participants gave the maximum shock. Finally, in the condition where the participant actually had to put the learner's hand on the shock plate every time they got an answer wrong, only 30% gave the maximum shock level. Thus, proximity of victims definitely has an influence on whether people obey or disobey authority. Milgram hypothesized that proximity influenced obedience to authority because the closer the victim is, both visually and physically, the less people can avoid the fact that they are hurting someone. When participants couldn't see or hear their victims, it was easy for them to obey authority since they couldn't hear or see the hurtful consequences of their actions. However, when people can see and hear their victims, they can't avoid the fact that they are hurting someone else. Also, in the condition where participants actually had to place their victim's hand on a shock plate, they cannot avoid the fact that they themselves were performing actions that were hurting someone else. Thus, in these types of situations, people are more likely to disobey authority. The influence of proximity on obedience explains why people can often obey authorities when doing so will knowingly harm other individuals. Many of the perpetrators of the Holocaust never saw their victims or the harmful consequences of their actions, which made it easier to carry out orders. It was easy for an SS officer to sign a piece of paper ordering Jews to enter the gas chamber when they never saw these Jews entering the gas chamber or leaving the gas chamber as corpses. It is also how bomber pilots can easily drop bombs during wars that they know will kill civilians because they can't see their victims and often don't see the actual hurtful consequences of their actions. Milgram also wanted to see how the willingness of victims to endure hurtful consequences influenced obedience to authority figures. Even if learners demanded the experiment continue, if the authorities said stop, then people stopped. And when learners say beforehand that they'll participate only if they can quit at any time, less people gave maximum shock. So in one version of his obedience experiment, Milgram had the authority figure tell the participant to stop, but Milgram had the learner demand that the experiment continue. In this condition, as you can see here, no one went to the highest shock level. In another version of this obedience experiment, Milgram had the learner say before the experiment that he had a heart condition and that he would only participate if he could quit at any time. which the experimenter agreed to in front of the participant. In this condition, as you can see here, fewer participants went to the highest level of shock than when the victim didn't make this statement. However, the average maximum voltage still given was 330 volts, which can seriously hurt someone with a heart problem. Milgram also investigated how the characteristics of authority figures influence obedience to them. One characteristic of authority figures that Milgram investigated was the proximity of the authority figures to the participants. In most versions of this experiment, the authority figure was in the same room as the participants. Thus, participants knew that the authority figure could actually see what they were doing. However, in one version of the experiment, Milgram had the authority figure leave the room and give the instructions to the participants over the telephone. As you can see here, only about 21% of participants in this condition gave the maximum shock. In fact, many of the participants in this experiment actually lied to the experimenter, telling the experimenter that they were giving larger shocks than they actually were. Thus, when the authority is away, the mice will disobey. And in another version of this experiment, Milgram had the experimenter tell the participant that he could choose whatever amount of voltage he wanted during the experiment. And in this condition, only one participant went to the maximum shock level. And the average level of shock given was 90 volts. Not that pleasant, but definitely not that hurtful either. Both of these versions of Milgram's experiment show that obedience to authority and not aggression is key to understanding the overall results of his experiments. When Milgram first presented his results, many people argued that he was just giving people a situation where they could just release their aggressive impulses without repercussions. And so, of course, you're going to see people giving maximum level of shocks. They get to just let out all these aggressive impulses on this random stranger without any repercussions. But these experiments showed otherwise, because if people were giving the maximum level of shock because they were venting their pent-up aggression, then participants who were allowed to choose a shock level probably would have given shocks on average greater than 90 volts. Also, Milgram's finding that when given the opportunity, people will actually lie to the authority figure so they don't have to give very hurtful shocks, further dispels the notion that the results of the experiments are just simply due to people venting their pent-up aggression. These results also shed light on the Jewish Holocaust. Many people originally believed that the perpetrators of the Jewish Holocaust were sadists who enjoyed inflicting pain and death on others. However, during their war crime trials, people were shocked to learn that most of those who perpetrated this Holocaust were, in their everyday lives, very nice and unassuming individuals who seemingly wouldn't hurt a fly. Many people ask how such apparently non-aggressive, normal people could do such hurtful things to others. And the answer is probably because they were doing what they were told to do by the authorities of the Nazi-led German government. Milgram wanted to make sure that it was obedience to authority that was causing people to perform hurtful actions. So he set up some versions of his experiment where he had the authority as the victim. And he also wanted to see what would happen if two authority figures gave conflicting demands to the participants. So, in one version of his experiment, Milgram had the authority figure assume the role of the learner, and a regular guy who was also a paid actor assumed the role of the authority and who gave the orders to continue. And as you can see here, only 20% of the participants went to the highest level of shock in this condition. This provided Milgram with evidence that many people gave the highest shock levels because they were obeying authority figures, since in this experiment many people ignored the demands of non-authority figures to continue on to high levels of shock. In a similar version of that experiment, Milgram had two experimenters, and he had one of these authority figures conduct the experiment, and the other authority figure assumed the role of the learner. In this condition, 65% of participants gave the maximum level of shock. Milgram also did one version of his experiment where there were two authorities, but one wanted to stop the experiment on hearing the pains of the learner, and the other authority wanted to continue. In this condition, most participants stopped, and none went to the full shock level. This finding suggests that when authorities conflict, people will often follow the commands of the authority figure that allows them to not perform others. Again, dispelling the notion that all these results are simply due to people venting pent-up aggression. Milgram also performed versions of the experiment to see if participants who did not actually perform the hurtful behavior but were rather just bystanders would disobey by trying to stop others from hurting others. In a version of his experiment, Milgram had the participants serve as a teacher and had a peer, who was actually a paid actor, be the one who administered the shocks. In this condition, participants allowed the peer to continue to the maximum level of shock 93% of the time. Thus, bystander status actually makes people more prone to obey authority. This is because when people are bystanders, they feel even less responsibility for hurting others by obeying authority. Since they are not actually performing the hurtful behavior, they can deflect responsibility onto others and away from themselves. Again, these findings can explain some of what happened during the Jewish Holocaust. Many German citizens knew about the atrocities that were happening in the concentration camps, yet few did anything about it. Many wondered how the citizens of Germany could just let these things happen around them. If Milgram's results are any indication, this happened because most German citizens were bystanders to these atrocities, and thus they could deflect responsibility for the atrocities from themselves onto others. They basically told themselves, I'm not hurting anybody, so I'm not to blame. It's not my responsibility to do anything about it. Milgram also did several versions of his experiment to see if participants' obedience was influenced by peers' disobedient behavior. In one version of his experiment, Milgram had two actors pretend that they were teaching peers with the participants. Milgram had the first peer object to the experiment and stop participating at 150 volts. Milgram had the second peer object and stop participating at 210 volts. And in this experiment, only 10% of participants gave the maximum shock, and most stopped at 210 volts or sooner. Thus, having disobedient and rebellious peers makes people more likely to be disobedient themselves. To Milgram, peer rebellion leads to less obedience for several reasons. Some of these reasons are similar to the reasons why people resist normative influence. First, peer rebelling instills the idea of defying authority in participants. It may be the case that some participants continue obeying the authority because the thought of actually stopping and disobeying the authority doesn't even cross their minds. Second, peer rebellion shows that disobedient actions are okay to do. People may continue doing hurtful things because of an authority's commands because they don't think that stopping is the correct thing to do in the situation. Peer rebellion, however, shows that disobeying the authority figure might be the right and moral thing to do. Third, peer rebellion works because disobedient peers disapprove of continuing to obey the authority's commands. People tend to want the social approval of others, and thus participants may believe that continuing with the experiment would have brought them social disapproval from their peers after their peers rebelled. Fourth, peer rebellion demonstrates to people that there are little punishments for disobeying the authority figure. After the peers rebelled and nothing happens to them, people might feel more comfortable disobeying because they find out that there are no negative consequences for actually disobeying authorities. Finally, peer rebellion works because it weakens the perceived power of the authority figure. If the authority figure can't get other people to obey him, this weakens his perceived authority, and thus people might feel more comfortable disobeying the authority. So the participants influence their obedient behavior. What Milgram found was that the socio-demographic characteristics of participants were very poor predictors of obedience. For example, there were no differences in the level of obedience between men and women, nor were there any real differences between Republicans and Democrats. Milgram did find some very small differences between religious affiliations. Catholics were more obedient than Protestants. Education, the more educated were less obedient than the less educated. Military status, those that served in the military were more obedient than those who had not. And occupational status, teachers and physicians were less obedient than engineers and business people. However, these differences were so small as to be negligible. The results show that personal characteristics do not protect people from the power of authority. However, subsequent research has found that personality characteristics do predict obedience to authority. In particular, those that have strong, agreeable, and conscientious personalities tend to be more obedient than others. Those with agreeable personalities tend to follow norms and are very adverse to upsetting others. Thus, it is no wonder that they are more obedient to authority. People with this type of personality trait tend to want to please others and to not want to rock the boat. And to do this, they often follow the commands of others, especially authority figures. Those with conscientious personalities tend to put a lot of importance on fulfilling one's duty. It is no wonder then why people with this personality trait would be very willing to obey authority. People with this personality trait believe that obeying the commands of authority figures is their duty, no matter the consequences. According to Milgram, obedience to authority occurs because people enter into an agentic state when obeying the commands of authorities. An agentic state is a condition where a person sees herself as an agent for carrying out another's wishes. It is the opposite of autonomy, where a person sees herself as carrying out her own wishes. According to Milgram, people shift to an agentic state very easily, given that mostly everyone has grown up following the orders of authority figures, like parents and teachers, and have been rewarded for doing so. Society is full of authority figures, and society rewards people for doing what the authorities tell them to do. For example, children in school get good grades if they obey the authority of their teachers. In other words, because of the socialization process, people in society are prone to enter agentic states and are thus susceptible to the power of authority in influencing their behavior. Obeying authority, especially authorities that order people to do hurtful actions towards others, causes a considerable amount of strain or negative emotions such as anxiety and anger. The strain usually results from the fact that people who usually think they are good and moral people are doing something hurtful to another human being. Milgram found that individuals manage the strain they experience from obeying authority in a variety of ways. One strategy people use to deal with this strain is avoidance. This strategy, according to Milgram, is the most basic and most used strategy used to deal with strain. Avoidance is when people try to avoid noticing the consequences of their hurtful actions. For example, many of Milgram's participants turn their heads to avoid seeing their victims suffer. Also, some participants would read the word pairs in a loud, overpowering voice during the experiment to drown out the screams of their victims. Another strategy that people use to deal with the strain of obeying authority is denial. This is when people try to deny the consequences of their actions. They would tell themselves that they weren't hurting anybody. Many of the participants denied that they had really done any harm at all, telling themselves that the shocks weren't really that bad. This strategy was commonly used by German citizens during World War II. Many German citizens denied that their government was causing so much death and that the concentration camps couldn't be all that bad. Another strategy people use to deal with the strain of obeying authority is subterfuge. This strategy involves disobeying the authority in secret when possible. For example, in the experiment where the authority gave participants instructions over the phone, many actually lied to the experimenter and told them that they were giving bigger shocks than they actually were. This was a very uncommon strategy in Milgram's experiments, however, since surveillance by authorities was high in most conditions. Another strategy people use to deal with the strain of obeying authority figures is blaming the victim. This is where the people doing harm blame the victims themselves for their suffering. Milgram noticed that several participants did this during the experiments. Participants would often say that if the learners didn't want to be shocked, they shouldn't have participated, and they got angry at the learners for being so apparently stupid. This strategy allowed participants to place the blame for their hurtful actions not on themselves but onto their victims. Finally, another strategy people use to deal with the strain of obeying authority is dissent. This is where people say that they disagree with the experiment and the authority figure, yet they continue obeying the authority. According to Milgram, dissent allows people to vent their disagreement with the experiment, which thus allows people to make sure that the blame for their hurtful actions is placed squarely on the authority figure. This allows people to continue obeying the authority while at the same time protecting their sense that they are good and decent people. According to Milgram, each of these strain management strategies allows people to continue to obey authority. This is because these strategies help people in some way protect their positive senses of self from their actions. For example, if a person can't see or hear the consequences of their hurtful actions, it allows them to keep believing that they are good and decent people. Sometimes, however, these strain management strategies don't work and the strain becomes overwhelming. According to Milgram, when this happens, people become disobedient. According to Milgram, disobedience is a process that occurs in 5 stages. The process starts with inner doubt, where the person begins to think that what he or she is doing is wrong. The next stage is external doubt, which is where the person actually tells someone, usually the authority, that he or she believes that they might be doing someone harm and thus stop what they're doing. The third stage is dissent. This is where the person voices disagreement with the authority figure over continuing to obey the authority's orders. The fourth stage is the threat stage. This is where the person tells the authority that he is going to stop following the orders soon. Just you wait. Now, according to Milgram, external doubt, dissent, and threats are ways that people try to persuade the authority figure to stop commanding harm. These are sort of tactful ways that a person can try to challenge the authority without actually disobeying the authority. And the final stage is actual disobedient behavior, not doing what the authority figure orders you to do. After the person has tried to persuade the authority but has been unsuccessful, the person often feels that they have no other choice but to disobey. Disobedience is emotionally trying on the individual. This is because they often feel that they have let people down by disobeying, particularly the authority figure. Because of the negative emotions people anticipate experiencing for disobeying authorities, most people try to avoid as much as possible disobeying authorities. In short, Milgram's experiments clearly demonstrate the power of authority for influencing people's behavior. Some might say that this wouldn't be the case today, however, because younger generations are less obedient to authority than older generations. But this is far from the case. Recently, several social psychologists have replicated Milgram's experiments and found that people are just as obedient to authority today as they were back in the 1960s. Many people also reject the idea that an authority figure can make them do harmful things to other people. They often tell themselves others may do that, but not me. And this is what makes authority so powerful in influencing behavior. It is when people deny something about themselves that they are in the most dangerous of coming to what they have denied. So that is the lecture on conformity and obedience. Next set of lectures will be on social perception and cognition. Bye-bye.